only a transition to a different sphere of consciousness. Carol Ann is not like those she's with. She is a living presence in their spiritual earthbound plane.
Hello and welcome to episode 75 of the Talking to the Dead podcast. This week has been quite exciting for me because at last the documentary called The Age of Disclosure, directed by Dan Farah, has finally gone into streaming. It's on Amazon Prime. Some people are criticizing that it's extremely expensive to watch it. I think it's over 20 euros or $20 maybe to watch it. But it is considered to be at the moment the real tipping point in terms of public awareness on the UAP consciousness debate. Anyone who's been following my podcast will know most of the stuff that's in this documentary. But it still is landmark. It's still groundbreaking, because it's the first time that all these different discussions about reverse engineering of UAP craft, and also the type of craft that are visiting and the consciousness aspect, have been discussed in a legitimate, very well-produced documentary. And it's going to really, I think, excite the world. I mean, Dan Farah goes as far as to say that he thinks it's going to cause Donald Trump to talk about all the things that he knows, and disclosure will be imminent. I will hold my breath on that one. What particularly struck me in the documentary is something that I've seen also in other discussions with various YouTube hosts, and also read about it in various books, which we'll talk about, is how alien disclosure is being held back in the United States government, or maybe with the contractors, whoever is the secret government, or whoever is holding all this stuff back. They're holding it back for many reasons, but one of the main reasons is that the Christian fundamentalists there are really fearful that in fact the UAP phenomenon is really religious. It's connected to the Bible, it's connected to angels and demons and the second coming of Christ. And this could be extremely destabilizing for the Catholic Church. What happens to us when we die is something that many religions are a little bit squeamish about. I know for certain that with Christianity, there's that sense that you're not really supposed to be talking about death, and you're not supposed to talk about demons and the afterlife and anything other than being a wonderful paradise and a reward for all the good things that you've done. But when you actually talk about UFOs or interdimensional beings, most definitely the Catholic Church wants to close down about that, even though some people suspect it knows quite a lot. So I wonder why the religious community is sort of closing ranks about now, when we're talking about imminent disclosure of the fact that UAPs have been visiting us or have been here for millions of years. Why is this such a threat to people of a religious persuasion? And I think the most important thing I can do for you is to tell you what the major religions are saying about life after death. And it's very clear that one question has remained universal amongst all cultures and continents for many centuries, that when we die, something else happens. It's not as if we just suddenly cease to exist. They believe many different things, and each religion has its own perspective on the meaning of life and mortality, as well as our place in the universe. If we want to begin with Christianity, I know that Christians believe that after death, the soul faces judgment, and those who have accepted God and lived according to Christ's teachings are welcomed into the kingdom of heaven. And this is always described as a place of eternal communion with God. But those who reject God or live in a very wrong life, in a life full of sin, can face separation from God, and this is often understood by Christians as being hell. Now, some branches of Christianity even still teach the idea of purgatory, which is a sort of a temporary state before you go to heaven, where perhaps slightly unclean spirits have to be purified. Islam is a belief that is also centered around judgment, and after death, people believe that when they go to their grave, they're waiting for a day of resurrection, and on that day, God will judge all souls based on what they've done, their deeds, and how good their faith has been. And those who've lived righteously will end up in paradise, and this is described as a place usually of peace and joy and closeness to God. Those who have rejected faith or committed a great wrong will usually face hell as well. And this is depicted as a place of purification as well as punishment, depending on the interpretation. Judaism, these views of the afterlife are quite diverse. I mean, traditional Jewish teachings speak of Olam Haba, or the world to come, a spiritual realm where souls experience closeness to God. And some Jewish texts describe a form of judgment and a temporary purification known as Gehinnom, while others emphasize living a righteous life in the present rather than focusing on what comes next. There's also belief amongst the Jewish people, particularly the Orthodox ones, in a future resurrection of the dead. Hinduism has a very rich tradition of teachings about reincarnation, and Hindus believe that the soul, or Atman, is eternal, and after death, the soul is reborn in a new body, and this is a cycle of birth and death and rebirth, and they call it samsara, and it continues until the soul achieves moksha, or liberation, and moksha is freedom from this cycle and a return to being with the divine as one. One's rebirth, however, is shaped by karma. These are the moral consequences of one's actions on earth. Similarly, Buddhism teaches the cycle of rebirth, and when we die, we are reborn into a new existence based on our karma. But Buddhism emphasizes that there is no permanent soul, only a continuation of consciousness. And that's an important point. The ultimate goal is nirvana, or the end of suffering, and liberation from the cycle of rebirth. Some traditions also describe various heavenly or hellish realms where beings may be reborn temporarily. I remember as a young man really loving the George Harrison song, Give Me Love. And I suppose the lyrics where he sings, give me peace on earth, give me light, give me life, and keep me free from birth, are probably echoing that Buddhist philosophy. And the next one, Sikhism, they have a belief in reincarnation, and life is seen as a journey towards merging eventually with God. That's particularly interesting, this idea that there is one great big consciousness and we all merge together. And after death, souls continue to be reborn until they achieve this liberation. They know this as mukti. And they get this liberation through devotion, humility and righteous living. But liberation also means union with the divine, and again freedom from birth, the cycle of birth and death. Let's briefly consider Taoism, which views death not as an ending but a natural transformation. Taoist teachings vary widely, but many emphasize harmony with the Tao, or the natural way of the universe. Some Taoist traditions believe that the spirit continues in another realm, while others focus more on a spiritual immortality achieved through living in balance and cultivating an inner virtue. And finally, I think if you look at traditional indigenous or tribal religions, such as the Amazonians, they share a belief in an afterlife where ancestors are watching over the living, and this is very common through human history. Certainly within all magical realms, such as Thelema, there's a lot of talk about the dead, but they are watching over us, or they mean us good, and they are helping us live our life. Many in this traditional tribal religious way describe the dead as journeying to a spirit world that is almost a mirror of this world that we're living in. And they emphasize a continuity, community, and ancestral connection. So, while the religions of the world offer different visions of life after death, they share a powerful truth. Each seeks to give meaning to our lives, to guide us towards goodness, and to help with that mystery of our final transition. And so, whether it's heaven or rebirth or liberation or ancestral presence, humanity has always sought assurance that death is not simply an end, but a passage. Now, back to Christianity. Many Christians, though not all of them, are expressing a lot of concern about unidentified aerial phenomenon, or UAP, and the alien disclosure topic for a combination of various things that came through in the documentary, The Age of Disclosure. It's a theological problem, it's a psychological problem, and it's a cultural problem for them. Basically, firstly, it raises questions about humanity's special role, and Christianity teaches that humans are uniquely created in the image of God, and for some believers, the idea of intelligent extraterrestrial life raises questions like, are we still unique? I think they also worry that did Jesus die only for humans, or did he die for other beings as well? And also, would intelligent aliens have their own special relationship with God? Many Christian theologians say extraterrestrial life wouldn't contradict Christian doctrine, but the uncertainty can still cause some anxiety. I think, secondly, there's a tremendous fear it could challenge or discredit religious scripture. Some Christians are very worried that alien life might contradict the Genesis creation story if it's interpreted literally, as it is in quite a few religious communities, particularly in the United States. They also worry that governments, if they do disclose extraterrestrial intelligence, it might be used to undermine religious faith, and that probably feeds into their fear of evil and the devil, and that he's working through aliens to undermine Christianity. This concern is often amplified by social media and conspiracy theories, and there's a lot of stuff out there, sensational stuff, talking about UAPs in this way. The third one is obviously the apocalypse and end-time interpretation. We've discussed that before, particularly the book of Revelation, but a portion of Christians interpret world events right now through the lens of biblical prophecy, and there is a tremendous amount of material out there, books and videos and documentaries, where fundamentalist Christians or even just normal Christians are talking about the fact that we are in end times. But this biblical prophecy, particularly books like the book of Revelation or Daniel or Ezekiel, get mentioned quite a lot. So UAP sightings get connected rightly or wrongly, to such ideas as these are signs from heaven, or they are signs of deceptive spiritual entities, or they're the signs of preceding the return of Christ, or even, of course, the Antichrist. Fourthly, I think there's an association, obviously, with demonic or spiritual beings in some Christian groups, not the mainstream denominations, but very influential circles within American society, believe that UAPs might have demonic deceptions. They could be fallen angels, or they are spiritual manifestations rather than physical extraterrestrials. And this viewpoint creates, again, fear, because the phenomenon is interpreted as a spiritual threat and not a scientific curiosity. In the Age of Disclosure documentary, they talk about this as being a particular problem, because if people are treating it as being non-scientific but a spiritual threat, then it'll keep people away from looking at the technology that perhaps has been given to us or found through crash retrievals as not a scientific, serious proposition. And we could be losing out massively on wonderful scientific discoveries that could help humanity. Of course, equally, there are a lot of other countries that may have this material, such as China or Russia, and they may not be quite so spiritual about it, and they may be actively scientifically looking at this material and maybe years ahead of America in this regard. And that is also slightly worrying to a lot of people in the military establishment in America. So this is leading, obviously, to that general discussion about a distrust of government and institutions. It always amazes me and my wife to an extent how America seems to be so full of people who distrust their government. I'm not terribly sure why this came about. Largely, I suppose, because of the history in the Civil War. But the UAP discussions really have created this sense amongst Americans that the government is hiding things and that there is a tremendous secrecy. And of course, you're seeing whistleblowers, you're seeing laws hopefully being passed, perhaps, to protect whistleblowers. So the whole idea of whistleblowers emphasizes this idea that there is something to hide. And then the old American CIA and the intelligence agencies always create, maybe because of Hollywood, a tremendous distrust amongst the American people in their government and institutions. So many Christians who probably came out in their numbers when they voted for Donald Trump view the government with suspicion, especially when people like Trump talk about the government as being a swamp and that nobody can be trusted and everything's fake news. UAP disclosure to these people can be perceived as a potential deception, a sign of maybe societal instability, but also a prelude to global uncertainty or end times. I think it also challenges people's familiar worldview. And I think I could certainly say that about my wife, who doesn't believe in any of this really. And even if it is true, it's not going to affect her day-to-day work. And she can't be bothered to get so excited about it because she can't honestly see what it's going to do to relieve all the stresses and the strains of daily life in the slightest, which still carry on whether we have aliens on the earth or not. But I think, my wife, like millions of people, if they're encountering something mysterious or unexplained and potentially intelligent outside of humanity, this probably does create some sort of existential tension. And that manifests itself, particularly with Christians, with big questions in their minds of what else is out there, or how big is creation, and what does it mean for faith. And even though many Christian thinkers, even people like C.S. Lewis, or even the people in the Vatican, argue that life is fully compatible with Christian belief, alien life, that is. But they find it very unsettling, and they feel that because it's uncertain, it can be very unsettling. I think the media has sensationalized the fear. They talk about UAP stories in very dramatic and fear-inducing ways, such as mysterious objects or possible threats or something the government isn't telling you. This emotional framing naturally heightens anxiety, especially among people already concerned with spiritual or existential topics. So yes, religions are very affected by UAP phenomenon, and Christians particularly, because of their worldview, because of the nature of God's creation, because of how they interpret the Bible, because they fear deception, which they feel is a sign of the devil, and because of uncertainty about humanity's place in the universe. Many Christians, and some very famous ones in history, have said that they sometimes doubt their faith, or they veer towards being agnostic suddenly, because this type of information, although it's very important, and Christian theologians probably welcome the possibility of extraterrestrial life and see no conflict with their faith, for many, though, alien life could either prove or disprove the wonder of God's creation. But of course, and you won't be surprised to hear it from me, what is fascinating is could the UAP phenomenon point to life after death? And, you know, the greatest mysteries that we have in life are we alone in the universe, and what happens to us when we die? And I have very much felt the need and the direction to join those two questions together in the last year. But the fascinating idea is how the modern UAP phenomenon and the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence might be offering clues that consciousness is not limited to the human body, and that death may not be the end of who we are. A little bit later, I'll just revisit what I started talking about in the last two episodes, the idea of non-local consciousness. But I want to emphasize that I can't prove anything with scientific certainty, and it's really just about talking to you about the possibilities, that there are possibilities that challenge our assumptions about reality, consciousness, and the boundaries of life. If we consider the extraordinary behavior of UAPs, these objects appear to defy our understanding of physics. They accelerate instantly. They maneuver with no visible propulsion, and they move in ways that seem impossible for any material craft. And some researchers have obviously proposed that these objects are probably not operating strictly within our familiar physical laws. They may be interacting with dimensions or forms of energy we do not yet understand. In the Age of Disclosure documentary, they talk about the technology that creates a time bubble around the craft, and these craft are operating within a totally isolated time and can move through any medium, and anything in their environment is meaningless to them. But imagine what this implies. It implies that their intelligence is capable of moving beyond the limits of time, of the physical world as we know it, and reality itself may be far more layered and mysterious than we assume. And if reality really is deeper than matter alone, then consciousness, or our inner experience of being, may also be more than the body that houses it. Some scientists and philosophers observing the UAP phenomenon suggest that advanced civilizations might not be physical in the way that we think. they suggest that they may be post-biological beings of pure consciousness or energy or information. And if that's true, that means intelligence can exist without a biological body. And if intelligence can exist without a body anywhere in the universe, then it becomes reasonable to ask, could human consciousness as well survive beyond the body? Many encounters described by witnesses in this documentary, military pilots, scientists and civilians, include elements that feel more like interactions with a mind than a machine. And these experiences often involve telepathy-like communication or a sensation of being observed or altered perception. Again, if this is true, that suggests consciousness may not be tied to physical form in the way we've long assumed. Some researchers note a striking overlap, as we've discussed before, between near-death experiences when consciousness appears to separate from the body and certain UAP reports that describe beings or phenomenon appearing in states of light or energy or non-physical presence. This doesn't prove a connection, but it raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps advanced intelligences understand consciousness and can manipulate it in ways that we do not or can. And perhaps their realms exist closer to what many spiritual traditions on earth call the soul. The very fact that governments, scientists and military institutions are admitting that something unknown and powerful is interacting with our world forces makes us need to reconsider the nature of existence. If we are not the only intelligent beings in the universe, if consciousness is far more widespread and more flexible and perhaps even more enduring than human biology, then maybe death is not the ending but a transition. Well, we of course know that. But the interesting thing is that the disclosure movement is making more people aware that the body is just temporary. It's not the essence of who we are. The real essence of what makes us think and feel and love and hope continues beyond the physical body. But the UAP phenomenon does not prove in itself life after death, but it does open the door to a much richer universe. It's much stranger than the consciousness that we once were told to believe. And in such a universe, the idea that we survive death is, of course, very comforting to people, but it's also, I think, entirely natural. So, most definitely, it would seem that intelligence can exist beyond the physical form. It can operate outside the limits of matter and of the physical reality that we hold. It's a universe itself built on many, many layers that we hardly understand. And of course, death is not the disappearance of the self, but just the shedding of a temporary vessel. Now, parallel with the alien disclosure movement and the understanding that perhaps we're dealing with a form of consciousness that is not a material consciousness as perhaps we understand it as we have learned to see it. Parallel with this is this imagery of heaven and hell that is being proposed by the Christians. Now, I think it's very interesting to see that heaven is always described as being somehow very expansive, and it's radiant with golden or white light, and it's filled with gardens and fountains or celestial music. And hell is just as consistent in its descriptions as being very dark and claustrophobic and full of torment, noise and fire and monstrous beings. Well, it's quite interesting that when people have been taking psychedelic drugs, or people have come back from near-death states, or even have had abduction experiences with alien species, or have had interaction with alien craft or alien species, and had that consciousness transference between either the craft or the entities, they also quite often report seeing detailed landscapes or these archetypes that they've never encountered on Earth. This supports, I suppose, Carl Jung's idea of a collective unconscious. So I think as cultures perhaps believe that the soul is something that is beyond the human mind, then the soul must be another word for our consciousness. I mean, the Egyptians have believed in the old times that nightly soul journeys would go alongside to the sun god. Buddhism have described the Bardo realms, these intermediate states of death where the soul encounters amazing lights and different deities, each offering a chance for recognition and liberation. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead teaches that if a person can recognize these states as projections of the mind itself, liberation is possible. And as I've shown earlier, all these traditions are there in Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, all the Chinese traditions, all the Japanese and the Buddhist systems, and also the Native American traditions. These ancient texts of these religions perhaps were not just a myth. They were spiritual manuals for the transition of dying, the movement of the consciousness out of the body. But they also served another purpose. They helped the living understand what life is through having to confront death. Now, many cultures give people a chance to experience death before dying, usually through dramatic symbolic enactments. The idea of death and rebirth, however, is not just limited to religions. It's also found in clinical settings with schizophrenic patients who are having acute episodes. And often they can describe journeys through hell or battles with demonic forces, encounters with divine judgment, and eventual rebirth and union with the divine. So many of these experiences can be quite pathological, but particularly striking evidence, of course, comes from psychedelic therapy, as we discussed last week with LSD and DMT. And in the 1950s and the 1960s, people were experimented on and found that the unconscious was somehow opened deeply. And when that happened, subjects spontaneously entered experiences that kind of mirrored the death and rebirth sequences of world religious traditions. And it took the form of struggling through tunnels and darkness and fire and judgment and transformation, culminating in liberation or union or spiritual rebirth. And these psychedelic experiences often followed patterns paralleling the psychological phases of biological birth, like moving through some sort of claustrophobic tunnel, as in birth, or violent death rebirth struggles, or being released into a radiant light and renewal, as the birth experience might be. These experiences probably made the subjects feel less afraid of death, generally more spiritually oriented, and quite often they reported a radical shift in their sense of identity and meaning. And certainly people who are taking hallucinogenic drugs now will report the same thing when they're taking, say, DMT. Human beings who are pushed to the edge of their consciousness with either drugs or spiritual practices, or perhaps in interactions with alien species and other forms of consciousness, or even people such as myself who are trying hard to channel spirits. It seems that we all enter some form of inner landscape, which proves that the afterlife is real. and that maybe the imagery that we see is symbolic rather than literal, but these experiences do reflect structures in the mind itself. And they certainly change how a person lives their life. I think when you've had some form of amazing experience, whether it's through drugs or religion or through being a medium, you can open the door to some form of transformation, some meaning, some liberation in life itself. Now, this leads me on to the last thing I want to talk about today, which is non-local consciousness. We mentioned that last week, and it's very much the topic at the moment and made famous in Dan Brown's new book, The Secret of Secrets. But the idea that all consciousness is non-local, that means it's not in your in yourself alone, but you're actually tapping into consciousness that's all around you, is something that is an amazing thought. What if, for a moment, you believe that traditional science says consciousness emerges from the brain? It's like if you a spark from wet wiring or something. But non-local consciousness kind of flips that. It's the idea that awareness isn't produced by the neurons firing, but it's tuned into them, like a radio picking up a signal from an infinite cosmic broadcast. This might be related to quantum entanglement, particles linked across vast distances, influencing each other instantly, defying Einstein's speed of the light rule. Now, proponents like physicist Sir Roger Penrose argue this non-local consciousness could be the substrate of the mind itself, encoded into the fabric of space-time. Pioneers like Dean Radin at the Institute of Noetic Sciences have spent decades testing this, and he has a new book which is called The Science of Magic. And Radin dives into how intention, your focused will, can nudge reality at a distance. These are PSI experiments. They're showing hits that are way beyond chance, hinting at a shared field of awareness. Now, as I'm speaking to you in November 2025, I am seeing all around me the field is exploding. And recently at a conference in Barcelona, researcher David Del Rosario presented evidence that non-local consciousness is tied to extrasensory perception, or ESP. This is mind syncing without words, and it's backed by a huge amount of analysis. He launched a bombshell paper in Computational and Structural Biotechnology Journal, and it dropped empirical proof of quantum entangled higher states of consciousness, biophysical glitches where awareness leaps beyond the body. There is a database that is called the Contrast database. It's tracking 511 brain experiments through mid-2025. And it shows that even if we look for consciousness, you can't find it as some sort of hot zone in the cortex or in the deeper structure of the brain. It's just not there. So maybe quantum microtubules or something are at play here. The philosopher Edward Kelly had another document recently called Philosophy and Non-Local Consciousness, and he calls it a fundamental informational field. It seems to organize reality like gravity bends space. It seems to transcend time. On X last week, there was an artist, Kelly Dale Moore, who's done an oil painting called Non-Local Consciousness, and it went viral. It visualizes as swirling ether, and people and podcasters are getting really excited interviewing Radin. His awareness interacts with the physical world like code in the Matrix. Now, the fun part of all this is if you look at the UAPs, like these tic-tacs that are zipping around and defying physics, what if they're not just nuts and bolts ships, but echoes of some entity's non-local minds? This is the quantum observer contact hypothesis, which was floated by researcher Kenneth Thomas in February. And it posits that UAPs are consciousness probes tied to our non-local field. Apparently we're all entangled, and reports always spike of seeing UAPs when observers are meditative or open, and this suggests a two-way communication via intent and not radio waves. This is the close encounters of the fifth kind, or the CE5 protocols, that I tried myself to a certain success when I was in Rendlesham Forest earlier in the year. In June, a mind field bulletin study analysed 1,180 UAP encounters, and 70% involved sensing or direct telepathic hits with non-human intelligence. They weren't craft. People can visualize a portal. They feel that they are downloading information from the UAP or from the entities. They experience sort of non-local uploads during blackouts, perhaps. Now, there is the new word psionic, which perhaps is not a new word. Maybe it's been around for a long time, but it's being talked about now as being how local people, local operators such as us, using this psionic framework, which is a consciousness-driven communication, maybe based on quantum theories, allow us to communicate with alien entities and upload and download, much like a modem. So finally, I just want to tie all this together as I end this episode. And it's that big one again. It's death. It's why I'm doing this podcast. I'm interested in death, what happens after death. Now, if consciousness is non-local, the end game really changes. There is no more sense that when you die, it's just oblivion. I read an interesting description of taking an anesthetic before an operation, that it switches off the brain and it's only switched on again as you come out of the anesthesia. And generally, you are in a complete state of blackness during the operation. And the examination of a person's brain and their brain waves during general anesthesia shows that the brain isn't working at all, apart from maintaining the fundamental systems that keep you alive. And many people have confused that perhaps with what happens when you die, thinking that must be the same thing. It's just lights out oblivion. But there is a lot of discussion now that are showing that using near-death experiences, they can show that even with a flatlined brain, lucid awareness persists. People are now realizing that conscious can linger maybe 20 hours post-clinical death. There is this sense that awareness is an eternal field. This non-local hypothesis that we're talking about is showing that there is some form of collective consciousness out there that we all tap into. These are non-local schools for the soul. Now, some people might say this is just sci-fi, it's just fiction or psychic fiction. But I would want you to think that it's a paradigm shift. Consider that very eminent people such as Hal Puthoff or Eric Davis are saying that these UAPs are showing a form of consciousness, a form of non-local information access. And this may help explain how our genetic material might act as some form of antenna for these exchanges. And even now, people don't fully understand what all our genetic material is doing. So, in a way, we're not just spectators. We're co-creators in this universal dialogue. All this trans-dimensional projection, this conscious craft, this feeling of being part of something greater than ourselves, all the evidence that's coming from non-local consciousness with UAPs is suggesting another spectrum that is accessible via our inner state. We're all entangled in a cosmic web, and we have this ability to whisper across this void. The evidence is mounting. Lastly, in terms of the spiritual and religious views, just to close off that thread, with Hinduism, they believe that consciousness is preceding the body and it enters at conception. Buddhism believe that there's a stream of consciousness that's joining us, and it joins the forming embryo and gradually integrates with the developing mind and the body. In the Kabbalah, Judaism, they believe that multiple levels of soul enter at different stages, lower levels at birth, higher levels at later in life. And of course, the indigenous worldview is that the spirit joins during pregnancy, but is fully present at birth. But, if we are going to understand ourselves and our place in the cosmic universe, we have to understand that consciousness is fundamental, and the brain is merely a receiver, it's an interface. And then you understand that at conception, the receiver is created. During gestation, it begins assembling the hardware. At birth, there's a massive sensory input and the whole thing boots up. And in our early years, our personality and our self-model develop. So it all gradually localizes. And eventually, this communication with outside consciousness will give us all these experiences that this podcast is all about, and maybe extraterrestrials or interdimensional beings have learned to manipulate, or they actually live within this consciousness as non-physical beings. Anyway, that's the end of it for this week. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.